John Calvin is the kind of man that a person either adores or abhors. But no matter how you feel about the man, you must admit that he is one of the most influential theologians in all of church history. He was born in France in 1509, and then he died here in Geneva, Switzerland in 1564. And it was here that he made such an impact on the Swiss Reformation. In fact, the Reformation around the world. His theology often is known as Calvinism, named for him, and yet perhaps more accurately it's known as Reformed theology, because it impacted the Reformation in so many places, not only in Europe but also in America and around the world. Now, when you think of Calvin, you think of his doctrine of predestination, the idea that God elects some for salvation and then he condemns others to damnation. But we need to realize that his doctrine of predestination stems from his most important doctrine, and that is the doctrine of the sovereignty of God. All of his theology flows out of his idea that God is supreme, that he is the highest power, the highest intellect, the majesty and creator of all of the world, all of humanity. Also, he teaches the doctrine of the depravity of humanity. And it seems as if Calvin felt about himself that he could not respond to God's call on his own, but instead depended upon irresistible grace. And so we need to appreciate Calvin for the good points of his theology and to recognize many of his contributions. Here in Geneva, he established the Reformed Church and emphasized church discipline and emphasized, therefore, the purity of the church, so that there was this idea of coming to the communion table with purity. And so he looked for those characteristics in his elders, and then through the elders of the entire community, with high expectations for the moral life. Of course, Calvin had helpers and those who assisted him in his work. And behind me is the Reformation wall. Prominently featured is John Calvin, but to his right is Guillaume Farel, or William Farel, who actually began the Reformation in Geneva. And when Calvin was passing through for only one night, Farel sought him out and begged him to stay and help with the Reformation in Geneva. Calvin wanted to go on to Strasbourg and live a life of a scholarly leisure, but Farel said, "No, if you do not stay and help the cause of the Reformation here, God will curse your rest." And so Calvin stayed and remained in Geneva. He did have, he stayed for a couple of years and then was exiled by the Libertine Party in Geneva, but soon he was recalled and spent the rest of his life here in Geneva. Now, another person who was very helpful in the cause was Theodore Beza, who eventually became the rector of the Geneva Academy. He was Calvin's successor and his biographer, and in many ways his interpreter. Then on the far side of these statues is John Knox. John Knox, the thundering Scot, was exiled from England under the persecution of Bloody Mary Tudor. He came to Geneva, and here he assisted in the academy. He translated the Geneva Bible here, and then when it was safe to return to England, he carried back with him the tenets and doctrines of Calvinism, and he founded the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. So Calvin's theology spread to Scotland. It played an important role in England among the Puritans and Separatists. In the Netherlands, it was the basis of the Dutch Reformed Church. All through Europe, there were representatives of Reformed theology. And then when the Puritans left England and went to settle the Massachusetts Bay Colony, then Calvinism was the dominant theology of the Congregationalist church there. In fact, also on the wall is included a statue of Roger Williams, who was one of the dominant Baptists of the early colonial life, the first one to adopt believers' baptism. Even though he didn't remain a Baptist for long, he was a particular Baptist, or that is to say a Reformed Baptist, and was very influential in calling for the separation of church and state in America. So all in all, John Calvin is one of the dominant figures of church history. Again, many do not like everything about what he did or taught, but he certainly was influential, and we can appreciate him for much that he did. So glad that I got a chance to be here in Geneva, Switzerland, and spend so much time where he taught and worked and ministered.